Fatal Forces. A horrible science book by Nick Arnold. Illustrated by Tony DeSalles. It's crunch time. Read by Vienna. Introduction. Science has one fatal flaw. It can be seriously boring. Ask a simple question and you're forced to listen to a really boring, complicated answer. Why does my ball fall? The force of gravitational attraction between your spherical object and the Earth is determined by their relative masses. Your what? And some answers have massive mysterious mathematics. But why does it fall so fast? Simple. 9.806 meters per second. G equals gm2r2. Totally bamboozled. And don't try arguing with the scientists either. So why doesn't it go up? Or you'll get a forceful reply. You can't break the laws of physics, my girl. See what I mean? It's enough to make you die of boredom. Now that wouldn't be fatal. So what are these laws? And what happens if you break them? Do you get expelled? Or perhaps there's a really horrible punishment in store for you. Maybe you'll be forced to endure extra science lessons with megatons of homework. And who forces you to obey these horrible laws anyway? Teachers? No. Well, what's forcing me to fall then? Forces force you, because forces force things to move. And a force can be anything from you flicking a pea to the awesome gravity of a giant star. So the effects of forces can be an intergalactic explosion or the pea ending up in your teacher's ear hole. This might cause an explosion too. But forces can have fascinating fatal effects, like crushing people, or making them sick, or pulling their heads off. Getting forces wrong at school isn't usually quite as fatal, just a bit of enforced detention from your teacher. That must be one of those horrible forces you were telling us about, sir. Crunch. Arrgh! So here's the real-life story of forces. It's a story involving fatal fortunes and horrible happenings, and it's all true. And who knows, after your words, you might feel that forces have a fatal attraction for you, too. You might even force your teacher to take your science homework seriously. If you can just force yourself to read the next page now. And I mean now. Nasty Newton. The prisoner was sick. In the madness of his fever, he imagined the courtroom candles were fiery ghosts. Again and again, hear the sentence of the judges. Death! Then he fainted. He woke in darkness. Dragging himself upright, he tried to explore the pitch-black cell. His feet slithered on the slimy floor. Then he stumbled, his hands grabbing at empty air. He'd collapsed on the edge of a bottomless pit. One more step and he'd have dropped like a stone. Exhausted, the prisoner fell asleep. But when he awoke, he found himself strapped to a low bench. Helpless, he peered upwards and gasped in horror. A giant statue towered over him. The grotesque figure had a huge pendulum swinging from its hands. The pendulum swung to and fro with an evil hiss. It ended in a razor-sharp blade, and each slow sweep brought his blade a little lower, a little closer. Hiss, hiss, hiss. Scores of huge rats stared hungrily from the shadows, waiting to feast on the prisoner's butchered corpse. The deadly hissing blade skimmed his bare chest. Don't panic, it's only a story. The Pit and the Pendulum was written in 1849 by the American author Edgar Allan Poe. But for scientists, Poe's story has a fatal fascination. The nasty forms of death. The Pit and the Pendulum involve forces. Falling into the well under the influence of gravity, the pendulum swing controlled by gravity and centripetal force. That's the force on the pendulum shaft that stops the swinging weight pulling away from the rest of the machine. These forces are fatal for the prisoner. Horrible health warning. Forces aren't human. You can't reason with them or persuade them. They are physical forces of nature with the power to kill. Fatal forces. Once you fall foul of fatal forces, you're finished. Postscript. Oh, by the way, I'll be pleased to know the prisoner escapes. How? By getting the rats to gnaw through his straps, of course. Bet you didn't think of that. Amazingly enough, these forces had already been explained by a forceful scientific megastar, the amazing Sir Isaac Newton. Hall of Fame, Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727. Nationality, British. Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day. The doctor thought baby Isaac wouldn't live because he was so weak and small. Relax, Boxing Day will be nice and quiet. But Isaac survived. He soon became interested in science, but his teachers didn't think he was especially brainy. In fact, Isaac was too busy performing experiments at home to work hard at school. Don't try this excuse. When young Isaac was 16, his mom asked him to run the family farm. But he proved to be a useless farmer. He spent all his time experimenting and allowed the sheep to guzzle their way through a cornfield. He was the best farmer we ever had. So Isaac went to Cambridge University instead. At university, he read every maths book he could find, including the ones without pictures. He wore scruffy clothes and was so absent-minded he often got lost on his way to supper. As far as Isaac was concerned, supper was for wimps. Who needed supper when you could do lovely science calculations instead? In 1665, a deadly plague struck London. Soon, 7,000 people were dying every week, and the authorities closed Cambridge University to stop the plague spreading. So Isaac went home. But instead of taking a holiday, he did extra homework. Very strange. But what homework? He invented calculus, a mathematical system still used today to plan rocket trips, and he also discovered that light contains colors. These vital discoveries were to influence maths and physics for 300 years. Then Isaac made a really incredible breakthrough. It may have happened like this. The Apple and the Moon. Woolsthorpe, England, 1666. It was getting dark, but the skinny young man ran his fingers through his shoulder-length hair and carried on reading. Isaac Newton was sitting in the orchard trying to figure out how the moon went round the earth. Suddenly, a call rang out from the old farmhouse. "Isaac, your supper's ready." "Yes, Mother." Thought Isaac. She always called me half an hour before supper. It's a trick to get me in on time. So he did nothing. If he had left the orchard when his mother called him, the entire history of science would have been different. But just then, something grabbed his attention. It had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for months, silently. At first, it was no larger than a tiny green bulge, but now it was bright red and the size of a man's fist, a living bubble of water and sugars, with sweet, juicy flesh and bitter seeds, all wrapped in a waxy skin. An apple. The most famous apple in science. "Isaac, your supper's on the table, and it's your favorite." "Coming, Mother." Isaac shivered as a cold breeze rustled the trees. Then he sighed and reluctantly closed his book. There was a silent snap. The slender stalk holding the apple to the tree gave way. Wrenched by an unseen force, the apple hurtled downward. It tumbled through the rustling leaves and bounced gently on Isaac's brainy bones. What would you have done? Perhaps you'd have eaten your supper and forgotten the apple. But Isaac wasn't like that. He rubbed his head and looked at the moon. It shone like a bright silver coin in the evening sky. So why doesn't the moon fall, too? He asked himself as he absent-mindedly munched the famous apple. For some strange reason, Isaac remembered his school and the dreaded bucket game. He hated the other kids for making him play. He remembered having to whirl a bucket of water around his head on a rope. It was hard work, and Isaac was a thin little boy. But amazingly, all the water had stayed in the bucket as if trapped by an unseen force. Yikes! Maybe that's what keeps the moon in place, he murmured. Then his mother shouted again, "Isaac, your supper's on the table, and it's stone cold." "I said I'm coming, Mother." As Isaac threw the apple away, he wondered what would happen if it reached the moon. The most famous apple core in science disappeared. There was a muffled meow as it splatted on the cat. Isaac had forgotten his supper. He was calculating how strong gravity would need to be to stop the apple sailing into space. Then he thought about how fast the moon has to move to prevent it crashing down to Earth. Later, a very annoyed Mrs. Newton stood in the doorway, shielding her candle from the cold night air. "Isaac, shield, I've fed your supper to the cat, and I'm going to feed your breakfast to the pigs." There was no answer from the orchard, but Isaac was still out there, and still thinking hard. Test your teacher. How much does your teacher really know about this famous scientist? 1. As a child, what was Isaac Newton's favorite toy? A. A chemistry set. B. A toy windmill powered by a mouse and a wheel. C. He hated toys. He preferred tricky math sums. Answer. 1. A toy windmill powered by a mouse and a wheel. He designed it himself. 2. What did he buy on his first day at university? A. A desk, ink, and a notebook for extra homework. B. New clothes and a ticket to the local fun fair. C. A loaf of bread to eat. A desk, ink, and a notebook for extra homework. 3. How did Newton solve tricky scientific problems? A. The answers came in a flash of inspiration when Newton was on the toilet. B. By talking things over with scientific friends. C. Worrying away at the problem day and night until he figured out the answer. Worrying away at the problem day and night until he figured out the answer. Newton became professor of mathematics at Cambridge, but no one attended his bum-numbingly boring lectures. So what did he do? A. He rounded up students and forced them to listen. B. Carried on talking to an empty room. C. Tried to make his lectures interesting with a few jokes and amusing stories. And that brings me to the end of the lecture. Any questions? Can I sweep up now, sir? 4. Carried on talking to an empty room. 5. Newton's dog, Diamond, knocked over a candle and years of hard work went up in flames. What did he do? A. Drew his sword and killed the dog. B. Rewrote his work from memory. C. He told the dog off and went on to study something new and experimental. Rewrote his work from memory. What your teacher score means. 1 to 2, your teacher's guessing. 3 to 4, your teacher knows a bit but doesn't know everything, much like any other teacher. 5, hard luck. Your teacher's read this book. Newton's moving book. Newton didn't publish his discoveries for 20 years. He was too busy with his mathematical work. But then, at last, fearful others might grab the glory, Newton wrote a book about his ideas. He shut himself away for 18 months and worked 20 hours a day. Sometimes Newton's assistant reminded him that he'd missed supper. "Have I?" Newton would murmur sleepily. Then he nibbled at the food and got back to work. "The carriage was for your supper, sir." Newton's book was called the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, and it was the most brilliant science book ever written. In it, he explained the whole universe in a way that made sense. Well, it would have been made sense if the book hadn't been in Latin and filled with mystifying maths. Newton described gravity and 3 crucial laws about forces and how things move.